Political activities upon return to the United States. Upon his return from the Soviet Union, Oswald had dealings with the Communist Party USA, the Socialist Workers' Party, and the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, and he also had minor contacts with at least two other organizations with political interests. For the purpose of determining whether Oswald received any advice, encouragement, or assistance from these organizations in planning or executing the assassination of President Kennedy, the Commission has conducted a full investigation of the nature and extent of Oswald's relations with them. The Commission has also conducted an investigation to determine whether certain persons and organizations expressing hostility to President Kennedy prior to the assassination had any connection with Lee Harvey Oswald or with the shooting of the president. Communist Party USA, Socialist Workers' Party. In August of 1962, Oswald subscribed to The Worker, a publication of the Communist Party USA. Communist Party USA, Socialist Workers' Party. In August of 1962, Oswald subscribed to The Worker, a publication of the Communist Party USA. He also wrote the Communist Party to obtain pamphlets and other literature which, the evidence indicates, were sent to him as a matter of course. Oswald also attempted to initiate other dealings with the Communist Party USA, but the organization was not especially responsive. From New Orleans, he informed the party of his activities in connection with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee discussed below, submitting membership cards in his fictitious chapter to several party officials. In a letter from Arnold S. Johnson, director of the Information and Lecture Bureau of the party, Oswald was informed that although the Communist Party had no organizational ties with the committee, the party issued much literature which was important for anybody who was concerned about developments in Cuba. In September 1963, Oswald inquired how he might contact the party when he relocated in the Baltimore-Washington area, as he said he planned to do in October, and Johnson suggested in a letter of September 19th that he get in touch with us here, New York, and we will find some way of getting in touch with you in that city, Baltimore. However, Oswald had also written asking whether, handicapped as it were by his past record, he could still compete with anti-progressive forces above ground, or whether, in your opinion, he should always remain in the background, i.e. underground. And in the September 19th letter received the reply that often it is advisable for some people to remain in the background, not underground. In a letter postmarked November 1st, Oswald informed the party that he had moved to Dallas and reported his attendance at a meeting at which General Walker had spoken and at a meeting of the American Civil Liberties Union. He asked Johnson for the party's general view of the latter organization and to what degree, if any, he should attempt to heighten its progressive tendencies. According to Johnson, this letter was not received by the Communist Party until after the assassination. At different times, Oswald also wrote The Worker and the Half-Davis Defense Committee enclosing samples of his photographic work and offering to assist in preparing posters. He was told that his kind offer was most welcomed, and from time to time we shall call on you, but he was never asked for assistance. The correspondence between Oswald and the Communist Party and with all other organizations is printed in the record accompanying this report. When Oswald applied for a visa to enter Cuba during his trip to Mexico City discussed below, Senora Sylvia Duran, the Cuban consular employee who dealt with Oswald, wrote on the application that Oswald said he was a member of the Communist Party and that he had displayed documents in proof of his membership. When Oswald went to Mexico, he is believed to have carried his letters from the Soviet embassy in Washington and from the Communist Party in the United States, his 1959 passport, which contained stamps showing that he had lived in Russia for 2.5 years, his Russian work permit, his Russian marriage certificate, membership cards, and newspaper clippings purporting to show his role in the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, and a prepared statement of his qualifications as a Marxist. Because of the massive papers Oswald did present showing his affinity for communism, some in the Russian language, which was foreign to Senora Duran, and because further investigation, discussed below, indicated that Oswald was not a member of the party, Senora Duran's notation was probably inaccurate. Upon his arrest after the assassination, Oswald attempted to contact John J. Apt, a New York attorney, to request Apt to represent him. Apt was not in New York at the time, and he was never reached in connection with representing Oswald. Apt has testified that he at no time had any dealings with Oswald, and that prior to the assassination he had never heard of Lee Harvey Oswald. Upon his return from the Soviet Union, Oswald also carried on a limited correspondence with the Socialist Workers' Party. In October of 1962, he attempted to join the party, but his application was not accepted since there was no chapter in the Dallas area. Oswald also wrote the Socialist Workers' Party offering his assistance in preparing posters. From this organization, too, he received the response that he might be called upon if needed. He was asked for further information about his photographic skills, which he does not appear to have ever provided. Oswald did obtain literature from the Socialist Workers' Party, however, and in December 1962 he entered a subscription to the affiliated publication The Militant. Apparently, in March of 1963, Oswald wrote the party of his activities and submitted a clipping with his letter. In response, he was told that his name was being sent to the Young Socialist Alliance for further correspondence, but the files of the alliance apparently contain no reference to Oswald. Neither the letter nor the clipping which Oswald sent has been located. Investigation by the Commission has produced no plausible evidence that Lee Harvey Oswald had any other significant contacts with the Communist Party USA, the Socialist Workers' Party, or with any other extreme leftist political organization. The FBI and other federal security agencies have made a study of their records and files and contacted numerous confidential informants of the agencies and have produced no such evidence. The Commission has questioned persons who, as a group, knew Oswald during virtually every phase of his adult life, and from none of these came any indication that Oswald maintained a surreptitious relationship with any organization. Arnold S. Johnson of the American Communist Party, James T. Tormey, Executive Secretary of the Hall-Davis Defense Committee, and Farrell Dobbs, Secretary of the Socialist Workers' Party, voluntarily appeared before the Commission and testified under oath that Oswald was not a member of these organizations and that a thorough search of their files had disclosed no records relating to Oswald other than those which they produced for the Commission. The material that has been disclosed is in all cases consistent with other data in the possession of the Commission. Social Labor Party. Oswald also wrote to the Socialist Labor Party in New York in November 1962 requesting literature. Horace Twyford, a national committeeman at large for the party in the state of Texas, was informed by the New York headquarters in July 1963 of Oswald's request, and on September 11, 1963, he did mail literature to Oswald at his old post office box in Dallas. On his way to Mexico City in September 1963, Oswald attempted to contact Twyford at his home in Houston. Oswald spoke briefly with Twyford's wife, identifying himself as a member of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, but since Twyford was out of town at the time, Oswald was unable to speak with him. Arnold Peterson, National Secretary and Treasurer of the Socialist Labor Party, has stated that a search of the records of the national headquarters reveals no record pertaining to Oswald. He explained that letters requesting literature are routinely destroyed. The Socialist Party Social Democratic Federation has also advised that a review of its record fails to reflect any information or correspondence pertaining to Oswald. Fair Play for Cuba Committee. During the period Oswald was in New Orleans from the end of April to late September 1963, he was engaged in activity purportedly on behalf of the now defunct Fair Play for Cuba Committee, an organization centered in New York which was highly critical of U.S. policy toward the Cuban government under Fidel Castro. In May 1963, after having obtained literature from the FPCC, Oswald applied for and was granted membership in the organization. When applying for membership, Oswald wrote National Headquarters that he had been thinking about renting a small office at my own expense for the purpose of forming a FPCC branch here in New Orleans. With his membership card, Oswald apparently received a copy of the Constitution and bylaws for the FPCC chapters and a letter dated May 29th, which read in part as follows. It would be hard to conceive of a chapter with as few members as seem to exist in the New Orleans area. I have just gone through our files and find that Louisiana seems somewhat restricted for fair play activities. However, with what is there, perhaps you could build a larger group if a few people would undertake the disciplined responsibility of concrete organizational work. We certainly are not at all adverse to a very small chapter, but certainly would expect that there would be at least twice the amount needed to conduct a legal executive board for the chapter. Should this be reasonable, we could readily issue a charter for a New Orleans chapter of the FPCC. In fact, we would be very, very pleased to see this take place and would like to do everything possible to assist in bringing it about. You must realize that you will come under tremendous pressures with any attempt to do FPCC work in that area, and that you will not be able to operate in the manner which is conventional here in the Northeast. Even most of our big city chapters have been forced to abandon the idea of operating an office in public. Most chapters have discovered that it is easier to operate semi-privately out of a home and maintain a P.O. box for all mailings and public notices. A P.O. box is a must for any chapter in the organization to guarantee the continued contact with the national, even if an individual should move or drop out. We do have a serious and often violent opposition, and this procedure helps prevent many unnecessary incidents which frighten away prospective supporters. I definitely would not recommend an office, at least not one that will be easily identifiable to the lunatic fringe in your community. Certainly, I would not recommend that you engage in one at the very beginning, but wait and see how you can operate in the community through several public experiences. Thereafter, Oswald informed National Headquarters that he had opened Post Office Box number 30061 and that against its advice he had decided to take an office from the very beginning. He also submitted copies of a membership application form and a circular headed Hands Off Cuba, which he had printed, and informed the headquarters that he intended to have membership cards for his chapter printed, which he subsequently did. He wrote 3 further letters to the New York office to inform it of his continued activities. In one he reported that he had been evicted from the office he claimed to have opened, so that he worked out of a post office box, and by using street demonstrations and some circular work sustained a great deal of interest but no new members. Oswald did distribute the handbills he had printed on at least 3 occasions. Once, while doing so, he was arrested and fined for being involved in a disturbance with anti-Castro Cuban refugees, one of whom he had previously met by presenting himself as hostile to Premier Castro in an apparent effort to gain information about anti-Castro organizations operating in New Orleans. When arrested, he informed the police that his chapter had 35 members. His activities received some attention in the New Orleans press, and he twice appeared on a local radio program representing himself as a spokesman for the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. After his return to Dallas, he listed the FPCC as an organization authorized to receive mail at his post office box. Despite these activities, the FPCC chapter which Oswald purportedly formed in New Orleans was entirely fictitious. Vincent T. Lee, former national director of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, has testified that the New York office did not authorize the creation of a New Orleans chapter, nor did it provide Oswald with funds to support his activities there. The national office did not write Oswald again after its letter of May 29th. As discussed more fully in Chapter 7, Oswald's later letters to the national office purporting to inform it of his progress in New Orleans contain numerous exaggerations about the scope of his activities and the public reaction to them. There is no evidence that Oswald ever opened an office as he claimed to have done. Although a pamphlet taken from him at the time of his arrest in New Orleans contains the rubber stamp imprint FPCC 544 Camp Street, New Orleans, Louisiana, investigation has indicated that neither the Fair Play for Cuba Committee nor Lee Harvey Oswald ever maintained an office at that address. The handbills and other materials bearing the name of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee were printed commercially by Oswald without the approval of the national headquarters. Oswald's membership card in the New Orleans chapter of the committee carried the signature of A.J. Heidel, purportedly the president of the chapter, but there is no evidence that an A.J. Heidel existed, and, as pointed out in Chapter 4, there is conclusive evidence that the name was an alias which Oswald used on various occasions. Marina Oswald herself wrote the name Heidel on the membership card at her husband's insistence. No other member of the so-called New Orleans chapter of the committee has ever been found. The only occasion on which anyone other than Oswald was observed taking part in these activities was on August 9, 1963, when Oswald and two young men passed out leaflets urging "Hands off Cuba" on the streets of New Orleans. One of the two men, who was 16 years old at the time, has testified that Oswald approached him at the Louisiana State Employment Commission and offered him $2 for about an hour's work. He accepted the offer, but later, when he noticed that television cameras were being focused on him, he obtained his money and left. He testified that he had never seen Oswald before and never saw him again. The second individual has never been located, but according to the testimony of the youth who was found, he too seemed to be someone not previously connected with Oswald. Finally, the FBI has advised the Commission that its information on undercover Cuban activities in the New Orleans area reveals no knowledge of Oswald before the assassination. Right-wing groups hostile to President Kennedy. The Commission also considered the possibility that there may have been a link between Oswald and certain groups which had bitterly denounced President Kennedy and his policies prior to the time of the President's trip to Dallas. As discussed in Chapter 2, two provocative incidents took place concurrently with President Kennedy's visit, and a third but a month prior thereto. The incidents were the demonstration against the Honorable Adlai E. Stevenson, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, in late October 1963 when he came to Dallas on United Nations Day. 2. The publication in the Dallas Morning News on November 22nd of the full-page, black-bordered paid advertisement entitled "Welcome, Mr. Kennedy." And 3. The distribution of a throwaway handbill entitled "Wanted for Treason" throughout Dallas on November 20th and 21st. Oswald was aware of the Stevenson incident. There is no evidence that he became aware of either the "Welcome Mr. Kennedy" advertisement or the "Wanted for Treason" handbill, though neither possibility can be precluded. The only evidence of interest on Oswald's part in rightist groups in Dallas was his alleged attendance at a rally at the Dallas Auditorium the evening preceding Ambassador Stevenson's address on United Nations Day, October 24, 1963. On the evening of October 25, 1963, at the invitation of Michael Payne, Oswald attended a monthly meeting of the Dallas chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union, in which he was later to seek membership. During the course of the discussion at this meeting, a speaker mentioned Major General Edwin A. Walker, resigned, U.S. Army. Oswald arose in the midst of the meeting to remark that a night or 2 nights before he had attended a meeting at which General Walker had spoken in terms that led Oswald to assert that General Walker was both anti-Catholic and anti-Semitic. General Walker testified that he had been the speaker at a rally the night before Ambassador Stevenson's appearance, but that he did not know and had never heard of Oswald prior to the announcement of his name on radio and television on the afternoon of November 22nd. Oswald confirmed his attendance at the U.S. Day rally in an undated letter he wrote to Arnold Johnson, director of the Information and Lecture Bureau of the Communist Party, mailed November 1st, 1963, in which he reported, "On October 23rd, I had attended an ultra-right meeting headed by General Edwin A. Walker, who lives in Dallas. This meeting preceded by one day the attack on Adlai Stevenson at the United Nations Day meeting at which he spoke. As you can see, political friction between left and right is very great here." In the light of Oswald's attack upon General Walker on the evening of April 10, 1963, discussed in Chapter 4, as well as Oswald's known political views, his asserted attendance at the political rally at which General Walker spoke may have been induced by many possible motives. However, there is no evidence that Oswald attended any other rightist meetings or was associated with any politically conservative organization. While the black-bordered "Welcome Mr. Kennedy" advertisement in the November 22nd Dallas Morning News, which addressed a series of critical questions to the president, probably did not come to Oswald's attention, it was of interest to the commission because of its appearance on the day of the assassination and because of an allegation made before the commission concerning the person whose name appeared as the chairman of the committee sponsoring the advertisement. The black-bordered advertisement was purported to be sponsored by the American Fact-Finding Committee, which was described as an unaffiliated and nonpartisan group of citizens who wish truth. Bernard Weissman was listed as chairman, and a post office box in Dallas was the only address. See Commission Exhibit Number 1031, page 294. The Commission has conducted a full investigation into the genesis of this advertisement and the background of those responsible for it. 3 of the 4 men chiefly responsible, Bernard W. Weissman, William B. Burley III, and Larry H. Schmidt, had served together in the U.S. Army in Munich, Germany in 1962. During that time, they had with others devised plans to develop 2 conservative organizations, one political and the other business. The political entity was to be named Conservatism USA, or CUSA, and the business entity was to be named American Business, or AMBUS, AMBUS. While in Munich, according to Weissman, they attempted to develop in their own minds ways to build up various businesses that would support us and at the same time support our political activities. According to a subsequent letter from Schmidt to Weissman, CUSA was founded for patriotic reasons rather than a personal gain, even though as a side effect, AMBUS was to have brought great return, as any business endeavor should. To establish their organizations, Weissman testified that they had planned while in Munich that in order to accomplish our goals, to try to do it from scratch would almost be impossible, because it would be years before we could even get the funds to develop a powerful organization. So we had planned to infiltrate various right-wing organizations and by our own efforts become involved in the hierarchy of these various organizations and eventually get ourselves elected or appointed to various higher offices in these organizations, and by doing this bring in some of our own people and eventually take over the leadership of these organizations. And at that time, having our people in these various organizations, we would then, you might say, call a conference and have them unite. And while no one knew of the existence of CUSA aside from us, we would then bring them all together, unite them, and arrange to have it called CUSA. Schmidt was the first to leave the service, settling in Dallas in October 1962. He became a life insurance salesman and quickly engaged in numerous political activities in pursuit of the objectives devised in Munich. He became affiliated with several organizations and prepared various political writings. Upon the release from the military, Weizmann and Burley did not immediately move to Dallas, though repeatedly urged to do so by Schmidt. On October 1st, 1963, Schmidt wrote Weizmann, "Adlai Stevenson is scheduled here on the 24th, on UN Day. Kennedy is scheduled in Dallas on November 24th. There are to be protests. All the big things are happening now. If we don't get in right now, we may as well forget it." The day of the Stevenson demonstration, Schmidt telephoned Weizmann again, urging him to move to Dallas. Recalling that conversation with Schmidt, Weizmann testified, and he said, "If we are going to take advantage of the situation, you better hurry down here and take advantage of the publicity and at least become known among these various right-wingers, because this is the chance we have been looking for to infiltrate some of these organizations and become known. In other words, go along with the philosophy we had developed in Munich." 5 days later, he wrote to Weizmann and Burley to report that as the only organizer of the demonstration to have publicly identified himself, he had become overnight a fearless spokesman and leader of the right wing in Dallas. "What I worked so hard for in 1 year and nearly failed finally came through one incident in one night." He ended, "Politically, Cusa is set. It is now up to you to get Ambus going." Weizmann and Burley accepted Schmidt's prompting and traveled to Dallas, arriving on November 4th, 1963. Both obtained employment as carpet salesmen. At Schmidt's solicitation, they took steps to join the John Birch Society, and through Schmidt, they met the fourth person involved in placing the November 22nd advertisement, Joseph P. Grinnan, Dallas independent oil operator and a John Birch Society coordinator in the Dallas area. Within a week to 10 days after Weizmann and Burley had arrived in Dallas, the four men began to consider plans regarding President Kennedy's planned visit to Dallas. Weizmann explained the reason for which it was decided that the ad should be placed. After the Stevenson incident, it was felt that a demonstration would be entirely out of order because we didn't want anything to happen in the way of physical violence to President Kennedy when he came to Dallas. But we thought that the conservatives in Dallas, I was told, were a pretty downtrodden lot after that because they were being oppressed by the local liberals because of the Stevenson incident. We felt we had to do something to build up the morale of the conservative element in Dallas, so we hit upon the idea of the ad. Weizmann, Schmidt, and Grinnan worked on the text for the advertisement. A pamphlet containing 50 questions critical of American policy was employed for this purpose and was the source of militant questions contained in the ad attacking President Kennedy's administration. Grinnan undertook to raise the $1,465 needed to pay for the ad. He employed a typed draft of the advertisement to support his fund's solicitation. Grinnan raised the needed money from three wealthy Dallas businessmen, Edgar R. Chrissy, Nelson Baker Hunt, and H.R. Bright, some of whom in turn collected contributions from others. At least one of the contributors would not make a contribution unless a question he suggested was inserted. Weizmann, believing that Schmidt, Grinnan, and the contributors were active members of the John Birch Society and that Grinnan eventually took charge of the project, expressed the opinion that the advertisement was the creation of the John Birch Society, though Schmidt and Grinnan have maintained that they were acting solely as individuals. A fictitious sponsoring organization was invented out of whole cloth. The name chosen for the supposed organization was the American Fact-Finding Committee. This was solely a name, Weizmann testified. As a matter of fact, when I went to place the ad, I could not remember the name. I had to refer to a piece of paper for the name. Weizmann's own name was used on the ad in part to counter charges of anti-Semitism which had been leveled against conservative groups in Dallas. Weizmann conceived the idea of using a black border and testified he intended it to serve the function of stimulating reader attention. Before accepting the advertisement, the Dallas Morning News apparently submitted it to its attorney for their opinion as to whether its publication might subject them to liability. Wiseman testified that the advertisement drew 50 or 60 mailed responses. He took them from the post office box early on Sunday morning, November 24th. He said that those postmarked before the attack on President Kennedy were favorable in tone. Those of later postmark were violently unfavorable, nasty, and threatening. And according to a report from Schmidt, those postmarked some weeks later were again of favorable tone. The four promoters of the ad denied that they had any knowledge of or familiarity with Lee Harvey Oswald prior to November 22nd or Jack Ruby prior to November 24th. Each has provided a statement of his role in connection with the placement of the November 22nd advertisement and other matters. An investigation has revealed no deception. The Commission has found no evidence that any of these persons was connected with Oswald or Ruby or was linked to a conspiracy to assassinate President Kennedy. The advertisement, however, did give rise to one allegation concerning Bernard Weissman, which required additional investigation. On March 4, 1964, Mark Lane, a New York attorney, testified before the Commission that an undisclosed informant had told him that Weissman had met with Jack Ruby and Patrolman J.D. Tippit at Ruby's Carousel Club on November 14, 1963. Lane declined to state the name of his informant, but said that he would attempt to obtain his informant's permission to reveal his name. On July 2, 1964, after repeated requests by the Commission that he disclose the name of his informant, Lane testified a second time concerning this matter, but declined to reveal the information, stating as his reason that he had promised the individual that his name would not be revealed without his permission. Lane also made this allegation during a radio appearance, whereupon Weissman twice demanded that Lane reveal the name of the informant. As of the date of this report, Lane has failed to reveal the name of his informant and has offered no evidence to support his allegation. The Commission has investigated the allegation of a Weissman-Ruby Tippit meeting and has found no evidence that such a meeting took place anywhere at any time. The investigation into this matter is discussed in a later section of this chapter dealing with possible conspiracies involving Jack Ruby. A comparable incident was the appearance of the Wanted for Treason handbill on the streets of Dallas 1 to 2 days before President Kennedy's arrival. These handbills bore a reproduction of a front and profile photograph of the president and set forth a series of inflammatory charges against him. Efforts to locate the author and the lithography printer of the handbill at first met with evasive responses and refusals to furnish information. Robert A. Surrey was eventually identified as the author of the handbill. Surrey, a 38-year-old printing salesman employed by Johnson Printing Company of Dallas, Texas, has been closely associated with General Walker for several years in his political and business activities. He is president of American Eagle Publishing Company of Dallas, in which he is a partner with General Walker. Its office and address is the post office box of Johnson Printing Company. Its assets consist of cash and various printed materials composed chiefly of General Walker's political and promotional literature, all of which is stored at General Walker's headquarters. Surrey prepared the text for the handbill and apparently used Johnson Printing Company facilities to set the type and print a proof. Surrey induced Klaus, a salesman employed by Lettercraft Printing Company of Dallas, whom Surrey had met when both were employed at Johnson Printing Company, to print the handbill on the side. According to Klaus, Surrey contacted him initially approximately 2 or 2.5 weeks prior to November 22nd. About a week prior to November 22nd, Surrey delivered to Klaus 2 slick paper magazine prints of photographs of a front view and profile of President Kennedy, together with the textual page proof. Klaus was unable to make the photographic negative of the prints needed to prepare the photographic printing plate, so that he had this feature of the job done at a local shop. Klaus then arranged the half-tone front and profile representations of President Kennedy at the top of the textual material he had received from Surrey so as to simulate a man-wanted police placard. He then made a photographic printing plate of the picture. During the night, he and his wife surreptitiously printed approximately 5,000 copies on Lettercraft Printing Company offset printing equipment without the knowledge of his employers. The next day, he arranged with Surrey a meeting place and delivered the handbills. Klaus's charge for the printing of the handbills was, including expenses, $60. At the outset of the investigation, Klaus stated to federal agents that he did not know the name of his customer whom he incorrectly described. He did say, however, that the customer did not resemble either Oswald or Ruby. Shortly before he appeared before the commission, Klaus disclosed Surrey's identity. He explained that no record of the transaction had been made because he saw a chance to make a few dollars on the side. Klaus's testimony received some corroboration from Bernard Weissman's testimony that he saw a copy of one of the wanted for treason handbills on the floor of General Walker's station wagon shortly after November 22nd. Other details of the matter in which the handbills were printed have also been verified. Moreover, Weissman testified that neither he nor any of his associates had anything to do with the handbill or were acquainted with Surrey, Klaus, Lettercraft Printing Company, or Johnson Printing Company. Klaus and Surrey, as well as General Walker, testified that they were unacquainted with Lee Harvey Oswald and had not heard of him prior to the afternoon of November 22nd. The Commission has found no evidence of any connection between those responsible for the handbill and Lee Harvey Oswald or the assassination. Contacts with the Cuban and Soviet embassies in Mexico City and the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. 8 weeks before the assassination, Oswald traveled to Mexico City, where he visited both the Cuban and Soviet embassies. Oswald's wife knew of this trip before he went, but she denied such knowledge until she testified before the commission. The commission undertook an intensive investigation to determine Oswald's purpose and activities on this journey, with specific reference to reports that Oswald was an agent of the Cuban or Soviet governments. As a result of its investigation, the Commission believes that it has been able to reconstruct and explain most of Oswald's actions during this time. A detailed chronological account of this trip appears in Appendix 13. Oswald was in Mexico from September 26, 1963 until October 3, 1963. See Commission Exhibits number 2478, 2481 on page 300. Marina Oswald testified that Oswald had told her that the purpose of the trip was to evade the American prohibition on travel to Cuba and to reach that country. He cautioned her that the trip and its purpose were to be kept strictly secret. She testified that he had earlier laid plans to reach Cuba by hijacking an airliner flying out of New Orleans, but she refused to cooperate and urged him to give it up, which he finally did. Witnesses who spoke with Oswald while he was on the bus going to Mexico City also testified that Oswald told them he intended to reach Cuba by way of Mexico and that he hoped to meet Fidel Castro after he arrived. When Oswald spoke to the Cuban and Soviet consular officials in Mexico City, he represented that he had intended to travel to the Soviet Union and requested an in-transit Cuban visa to permit him to enter Cuba on September 30th on the way to the Soviet Union. Marina Oswald has testified that these statements were deceptions designed to get him to Cuba. Thus, although it is possible that Oswald intended to continue on to Russia from Cuba, the evidence makes it more likely that he intended to remain in Cuba. Oswald departed from New Orleans probably about noon on September 25th and arrived in Mexico City at about 10 a.m. on September 27th. In Mexico City, he embarked on a series of visits to the Soviet and Cuban embassies, which occupied most of his time during the first 2 days of his visit. At the Cuban embassy, he requested an in-transit visa to permit him to visit Cuba on his way to the Soviet Union. Oswald was informed that he could not obtain a visa for entry into Cuba unless he first obtained a visa to enter the USSR, and the Soviet embassy told him that he could not expect an answer on his application for a visa for the Soviet Union for about 4 months. Oswald carried with him newspaper clippings, letters, and various documents, some of them forged or containing false information purporting to show that he was a friend of Cuba. With these papers and his record of previous residence in the Soviet Union and marriage to a Soviet national, he tried to curry favor with both embassies. Indeed, his wife testified that in her opinion, Oswald's primary purpose in having engaged in the Fair Play for Cuba Committee activities was to create a public record that he was a friend of Cuba. He made himself especially unpopular at the Cuban embassy by persisting in his demands that as a sympathizer in Cuban objectives, he ought to be given a visa. This resulted in a sharp argument with the consul Eusebio Azque. By Saturday, September 28, 1963, Oswald had failed to obtain visas at both embassies. From Sunday, September 29th through Wednesday morning, October 2nd, when he left Mexico City on a bus bound for the United States, Oswald spent considerable time making his travel arrangements, sightseeing, and checking again with the Soviet embassy to learn whether anything had happened on his visa application. Marina Oswald testified that when she first saw him after his return to the United States, he was disappointed and discouraged at his failure to reach Cuba. The general outlines of Oswald's activities in Mexico, particularly the nature and extent of his contacts at the Cuban embassy, were learned very early in the investigation. An important source of information relating to his business at the Cuban embassy was Senora Silvia Tirado de Duran, a Mexican national employed in the visa section of the Cuban embassy who was questioned intensively by Mexican authorities soon after the assassination. An excerpt from the report of the Mexican government summarized the crucial portion of Senora Duran's recollection of Oswald. In translation, it read as follows. She remembered that Lee Harvey Oswald was the name of an American who had come to the Cuban consulate to obtain a visa to travel to Cuba in transit to Russia the latter part of September or the early part of October of this year, and in support of his application had shown his passport in which it was noted that he had lived in that country for a period of 3 years, his labor card from the same country written in the Russian language and letters in that same language. He had presented evidence that he was married to a Russian woman and also that he was apparently the leader of an organization in the city of New Orleans called Fair Play for Cuba, claiming that he should be accepted as a friend of the Cuban Revolution. Accordingly, the declarant, complying with her duties, took down all of the information and completed the appropriate application form, and the declarant, admittedly exceeding her responsibilities, informally telephoned the Russian consulate with the intention of doing what she could to facilitate issuance of the Russian visa to Lee Harvey Oswald. However, they told her that there would be a delay of about 4 months in processing the case, which annoyed the applicant since, according to his statement, he was in a great hurry to obtain visas that would enable him to travel to Russia, insisting on his right to do so in view of his background and his loyalty and his activities in behalf of the Cuban movement. The declarant was unable to recall accurately whether or not the applicant told her he was a member of the Communist Party, but he did say that his wife was then in New York City and would follow him. Senora Duran stated that when Oswald understood that it was not possible to give him a Cuban visa without his first having obtained the Russian visa, he became very excited or angry, and accordingly the affiant called Consul Azque, who came out and began a heated discussion in English with Oswald that concluded by Azque telling him that if it were up to him, he would not give him the visa, and a person of this type was harming the Cuban Revolution rather than helping it. It being understood that in their conversation they were talking about the Russian Socialist Revolution and not the Cuban. Oswald maintained that he had 2 reasons for requesting that his visa be issued promptly, and they were, One, that his tourist permit in Mexico was about to expire, and the other, that he had to get to Russia as quickly as possible. Despite her annoyance, the declarant gave Oswald a paper in which she put down her name, Sylvia Duran, and the number of the telephone at the consulate, which is 112847, and the visa application was processed anyway. It was sent to the Ministry of Foreign Relations of Cuba, from which a routine reply was received some 15 to 30 days later, approving the visa, but on the condition that the Russian visa be obtained first, although she does not recall whether or not Oswald later telephoned her at the consulate number that she gave him. With the dates of Oswald's entry into and departure from Mexico, which had been obtained from the records of the Mexican Immigration Service very shortly after the assassination, the government of Mexico initiated a thorough investigation to uncover as much information as possible on Oswald's trip. Representatives of U.S. agencies worked in close liaison with the Mexican law enforcement authorities. The result of this investigative effort was to corroborate the statements of Senora Duran and to verify the essentials of Oswald's activities in Mexico as outlined above. Senora Duran is a well-educated native of Mexico who was 26 years old at the time of her interrogation. She is married to Senor Horacio Duran Navarro, a 40-year-old industrial designer, and has a young child. Although Senora Duran denies being a member of the Communist Party or otherwise connected with it, both Durans have been active in far-left political affairs in Mexico, believe in Marxist ideology, and sympathize with the government of Fidel Castro, and Senor Duran has written articles for El Dia, a pro-communist newspaper in Mexico City. The Commission has reliable evidence from a confidential source that Senora Duran, as well as other personnel at the Cuban embassy, were genuinely upset upon receiving news of President Kennedy's death. Senora Duran's statements were made to Mexican officials soon after the assassination, and no significant inaccuracies in them have been detected. Documents fitting the description given by Senora Duran of the documents Oswald had shown her, plus a notation which she said she had given him, were found among his possessions after his arrest. The Cuban government was asked to document and confirm the essentials of Senora Duran's testimony. Its response, which has been included in its entirety in this report, included a summary statement of Oswald's activities at the Cuban embassy, a photograph of the application for a visa he completed there, and a photograph of the communication from Havana rejecting the application unless he could first present a Soviet visa. See Commission Exhibit Number 2564, page 306. The information on these documents concerning Oswald's date of birth, American passport number, and activities and statements at the embassy is consistent with other information available to the Commission. CIA experts have given their opinion that the handwriting on the visa application, which purports to be Oswald's, is in fact his, and that although the handwritten notations on the bottom of the document are too brief and faint to permit a conclusive determination, they are probably Senora Duran's. The clothes which Oswald was wearing in the photograph which appears on the application appear to be the same as some of those found among his effects after the assassination, and the photograph itself appears to be from the same negative as a photograph found among his effects. Nothing of any of the documents raises a suspicion that they might not be authentic. By far, the most important confirmation of Senora Duran's testimony, however, has been supplied by confidential sources of extremely high reliability available to the United States in Mexico. The information from these sources establishes that her testimony was truthful and accurate in all material respects. The identities of these sources cannot be disclosed without destroying their future usefulness to the United States. The investigation of the Commission has produced considerable testimonial and documentary evidence establishing the precise time of Oswald's journey, his means of transportation, the hotel at which he stayed in Mexico City, and a restaurant at which he often ate. All known persons whom Oswald may have met while in Mexico, including passengers on the buses he rode and the employees and guests of the hotel where he stayed, were interviewed. No credible witness has been located who saw Oswald with any unidentified person while in Mexico City. To the contrary, he was observed traveling alone to and from Mexico City at his hotel and at the nearby restaurant where he frequently ate. A hotel guest stated that on one occasion he sat down at a table with Oswald at the restaurant because no empty table was available, but that neither spoke to the other because of the language barrier. Two Australian girls who saw Oswald on the bus to Mexico City relate that he occupied a seat next to a man who has been identified as Albert Osborne, an elderly itinerant preacher. Osborne denies that Oswald was beside him on the bus. To the other passengers on the bus, it appeared that Osborne and Oswald had not previously met. An extensive investigation of Osborne has revealed no further contact between him and Oswald. Osborne's responses to federal investigators on matters unrelated to Oswald have proved inconsistent and unreliable, and therefore, based on the contrary evidence and Osborne's lack of reliability, the Commission has attached no credence to his denial that Oswald was beside him on the bus. Investigation of his background and activities, however, disclose no basis for suspecting him of any involvement in the assassination. Investigation of the hotel at which Oswald stayed has failed to uncover any evidence that the hotel is unusual in any way that could relate to Oswald's visit. It is not especially popular among Cubans. There is no indication that it is used as a meeting place for extremist or revolutionary organizations. Investigation of other guests of the hotel who were there when Oswald has failed to uncover anything creating suspicion. Oswald's notebook, which he carried with him to Mexico City, contained the telephone number of the Cuban Airlines office in Mexico City. However, a Cuban visa is required by Mexican authorities before an individual may enplane for Cuba, and a confidential check of the Cuban Airlines office uncovered no evidence that Oswald visited their offices while in the city. Allegations of conspiracy. Literally, dozens of allegations of a conspiratorial contact between Oswald and agents of the Cuban government have been investigated by the Commission. Among the claims made were allegations that Oswald had made a previous trip to Mexico City in early September to receive money and orders for the assassination, that he had been flown to a secret airfield somewhere in or near the Yucatan Peninsula, that he might have made contacts in Mexico City with a communist from the United States shortly before the assassination, and that Oswald assassinated the president at the direction of a particular Cuban agent who met with him in the United States and paid him $7,000. A letter was received from someone in Cuba alleging the writer had attended a meeting where the assassination had been discussed as part of a plan which would soon include the death of other non-communist leaders in the Americas. The charge was made in a Cuban expatriate publication that in a speech he delivered 5 days after the assassination, while he was under the influence of liquor, Fidel Castro made a slip of the tongue and said, "The first time Oswald was in Cuba," thereby giving away the fact that Oswald had made one or more surreptitious trips to that country. Some stories link the assassination to anti-Castro groups who allegedly were engaged in obtaining illicit firearms in the United States, one such claim being that these groups killed the president as part of a bargain with some illicit organizations who would then supply them with firearms as payment. Other rumors placed Oswald in Miami, Florida, at various times, allegedly in pro-Cuban activities there. The assassination was claimed to have been carried out by Chinese communists operating jointly with the Cubans. Oswald was also alleged to have met with the Cuban ambassador in a Mexico City restaurant and to have driven off in the ambassador's car for a private talk. Castro himself, it was alleged, 2 days after the assassination, called for the files relating to Oswald's dealing with 2 members of the Cuban diplomatic mission in the Soviet Union. The inference drawn was that the dealings had occurred and had established a secret subversive relationship which continued through Oswald's life. Without exception, the rumors and allegations of a conspiratorial contact were shown to be without any factual basis, in some cases the product of mistaken identification. Illustrative of the attention given to the most serious allegations is the case of D, a young Latin American secret agent who approached U.S. authorities in Mexico shortly after the assassination and declared that he saw Lee Harvey Oswald receiving $6,500 to kill the president. Among other details, D said that at about noon on September 18th, waiting to conduct some business at the Cuban consulate, he saw a group of 3 persons conversing in a patio a few feet away. One was a tall, thin Negro with reddish hair, obviously dyed, who spoke rapidly in both Spanish and English, and another was a man he said was Lee Harvey Oswald. A tall Cuban joined the group momentarily and passed some currency to the Negro. The Negro then allegedly said to Oswald in English, "I want to kill the man." Oswald replied, "You're not man enough. I can do it." The Negro then said in Spanish, "I can't go with you. I have a lot to do." Oswald replied, "The people are waiting for me back there." The Negro then gave Oswald $6,500 in large denomination American bills, saying, "This isn't much." After hearing this conversation, D said that he telephoned the American embassy in Mexico City several times prior to the assassination in an attempt to report his belief that someone important in the United States was to be killed, but was finally told by someone at the embassy to stop wasting his time. D and his allegations were immediately subjected to intensive investigation. His former employment as an agent for a Latin American country was confirmed, although his superiors had no knowledge of his presence in Mexico or the assignment described by D. 4 days after D first appeared, the U.S. government was informed by the Mexican authorities that D had admitted in writing that his whole narrative about Oswald was false. He said that he had never seen Oswald anyplace and that he had not seen anybody paid money in the Cuban embassy. He also admitted that he never tried to telephone the American embassy in September and that his first call to the embassy was after the assassination. D said that his motive in fabricating the story was to help get himself admitted into the United States so that he could there participate in action against Fidel Castro. He said that he hated Castro and hoped that the story he made up would be believed and would cause the United States to take action against him. Still later, when questioned by American authorities, D claimed that he had been pressured into retracting his statement by the Mexican police and that the retraction, rather than his first statement, was false. A portion of the American questioning was carried on with the use of a polygraph machine with the consent of D. When told that the machine indicated that he was probably lying, D said words to the effect that he must be mistaken. Investigation, in the meantime, had disclosed that the embassy extension number D said he had called would not have given him the person he had spoke to, and that no one at the embassy, clerks, secretaries, or officers, had any recollection of his calls. In addition, Oswald spoke little, if any, Spanish. That he could have carried on the alleged conversation with the red-headed Negro in the Cuban embassy, part of which was supposed to have been in Spanish, was therefore doubtful. D now said that he was uncertain as to the date when he saw someone who looked like Oswald at the Cuban embassy, and upon reconsideration he now thought it was on a Tuesday, September 17th, rather than September 18th. On September 17th, however, Oswald visited the Louisiana State Unemployment Commission in New Orleans and also cashed a check from the Texas Employment Commission at the Winn-Dixie store, number 1425 in New Orleans. On the basis of the retractions made by D when he heard the results of the polygraph examination, and on the basis of discrepancies which appeared in his story, it was concluded that D was lying. The investigation of the commission has thus produced no evidence that Oswald's trip to Mexico was in any way connected with the assassination of President Kennedy, nor has it uncovered evidence that the Cuban government had any involvement in the assassination. To the contrary, the Commission has been advised by the CIA and FBI that secret and reliable sources corroborate the statements of Senora Duran in all material respects, and that the Cuban government had no relationship with Lee Harvey Oswald other than that described by Senora Duran. Secretary of State Rusk also testified that after the assassination, there was very considerable concern in Cuba as to whether they would be held responsible and what the effect of that might be on their own position and their own safety. Contacts with the Soviet Embassy in the United States. Soon after the Oswalds reached the United States in June 1962, they wrote to the Soviet Embassy in Washington, D.C. Oswald requested information about subscriptions to Russian newspapers and magazines and ultimately did subscribe to several Russian journals. Soviet law required Marina Oswald, as a Soviet citizen living abroad, to remain in contact with her nation's embassy and to file various papers occasionally. In 1963, after Oswald had experienced repeated employment difficulties, there were further letters when the Oswalds sought permission to return to the Soviet Union. The first such request was a letter written by Marina Oswald on February 17, 1963. She wrote that she wished to return to Russia, but that her husband would stay in the United States because he is an American by nationality. She was informed on March 8, 1963, that it would take from 5 to 6 months to process the application. The Soviet Union made available to the Commission what purports to be the entire correspondence between the Oswalds and the Russian embassy in the United States. This material has been checked for codes and none has been detected. With the possible exception of a letter which Oswald wrote to the Soviet embassy after his return from Mexico City discussed below, there is no material which gives any reason for suspicion. The implications of all this correspondence for an understanding of Lee Harvey Oswald's personality and motivation is discussed in the following chapter. Oswald's last letter to the Soviet Embassy in Washington, D.C., dated November 9, 1963, began by stating that it was written to inform you of recent events since my meetings with Comrade Kostin in the Embassy of the Soviet Union, Mexico City, Mexico. The envelope bears a postmark which appears to be November 12, 1963. Ruth Payne has testified that Oswald spent the weekend at her home working on the letter and that she observed one preliminary draft. A piece of paper which was identified as one of these drafts was found among Oswald's effects after the assassination. See Commission Exhibits number 15 and 103, page 311. According to Marina Oswald, her husband retyped the envelope 10 times. Information produced for the Commission by the CIA is to the effect that the person referred to in the letter as Comrade Kostin was probably Valery Vladimirovich Kostikov, a member of the consular staff of the Soviet Union in Mexico City. He is also one of the KGB officers stationed at the embassy. It is standard Soviet procedure for KGB officers stationed in embassies and in consulates to carry on the normal duties of such a position in addition to the undercover activities. The Commission has identified the Cuban consul referred to in Oswald's letter as Senor Eusebio Azque, the man with whom Oswald argued at the Cuban embassy, who was in fact replaced. The CIA advised the Commission, "We surmise that the references in Oswald's November 9th letter to a man who has since been replaced must refer to Cuban consul Eusebio Azque, who left Mexico for Cuba on permanent transfer November 18, 1963, 4 days before the assassination. Azque had been in Mexico for 18 years, and it was known as early as September 1963 that Azque was to be replaced. His replacement did arrive in September. Azque was scheduled to leave in October, but did not leave until November 18th. We do not know who might have told Oswald that Azque or any other Cuban had been or was to be replaced, but we speculate that Sylvia Duran or some Soviet official might have mentioned it if Oswald complained about Azque's altercation with him. When asked To explain the letter, Marina Oswald was unable to add anything to an understanding of its contents. Some light on its possible meaning can be shed by comparing it with the early draft. When the differences between the draft and the final document are studied, and especially when crossed-out words are taken into account, it becomes apparent that Oswald was intentionally beclouding the true state of affairs in order to make his trip to Mexico sound as mysterious and important as possible. For example, the first sentence in the second paragraph of the letter reads, "I was unable to remain in Mexico indefinitely because of my Mexican visa restrictions, which was for 15 days only." The same sentence in the draft begins, before the words are crossed out, "I was unable to remain in Mexico City because I considered useless." As already mentioned, the Commission has good evidence that Oswald's trip to Mexico was indeed useless and that he returned to Texas with that conviction. The first draft, therefore, spoke the truth, but Oswald rewrote the sentence to imply that he had to leave because his visa was about to expire. This is false. Oswald's tourist card still had a full week to run when he departed from Mexico on October 3rd. The next sentence in the letter reads, "I could not take a chance on requesting a new visa unless I used my real name, so I returned to the United States." The fact is that he did use his real name for his tourist card and in all dealings with the Cuban embassy, the Russian embassy, and elsewhere. Oswald did use the name of Lee on the trip, but as indicated below, he did so only sporadically and probably as the result of a clerical error. In the opinion of the Commission, based upon its knowledge of Oswald, the letter constitutes no more than a clumsy effort to ingratiate himself with the Soviet embassy. Investigation of other activities. Oswald's use of post office boxes and false names. After his return from the Soviet Union, Lee Harvey Oswald is known to have received his mail at post office boxes and to have used different aliases on numerous occasions. Since either practice is susceptible of use for clandestine purposes, the Commission has directed attention to both for signs that Oswald at some point made undercover contact with other persons who might have been connected with the assassination. Oswald is known to have opened 3 post office boxes during 1962 and 1963. On October 9, 1962, the same day that he arrived in Dallas from Fort Worth, and before establishing a residence there, he opened box number 2915 at the Dallas General Post Office. This box was closed on May 14, 1963, shortly after Oswald had moved to New Orleans. That portion of the post office box application listing the names of those persons other than the applicant entitled to receive mail at the box was discarded in accordance with postal regulations after the box was closed. Hence, it is not known what names other than Oswald's were listed on that form. However, as discussed in Chapter 4, Oswald is known to have received the assassination rifle under the name of A. Heidel and his Smith & Wesson revolver under the name of A. J. Heidel at that box. On June 3, 1963, Oswald opened box number 30061 at the Lafayette Square substation in New Orleans. Marina Oswald and A. J. Heidel were listed as additional persons entitled to receive mail at this box. Immediately before leaving for Mexico City in late September, Oswald submitted a request to forward his mail to the Payne's address in Irving, and the box was closed on September 26th. On November 1st, 1963, he opened box number 6225 at the Dallas Post Office Terminal Annex. The Fair Play for Cuba Committee and the American Civil Liberties Union were listed as also being entitled to receive mail at this box. Oswald's use of post office boxes is consistent with other information known about him. His frequent change of address and receipt of communist and other political literature would appear to have provided Oswald reason to have rented postal boxes. These were the explanations for his use of the boxes which he provided Postal Inspector H.D. Holmes on November 24th. Moreover, on October 14, 1963, he had moved into a room on Beckley Avenue under the name of O. H. Lee, and it would have been extremely difficult for Oswald to have received his mail at that address without having disclosed his true name. The boxes cost Oswald only $1.50 or less per month. Although the possibilities of investigation in this area are limited, there is no evidence that any of the 3 boxes was ever used for the surreptitious receipt of messages or was used by persons other than Oswald or his family. No unexplainable notes were found among Oswald's possessions after his arrest. Oswald's box on the day of the assassination, number 6225, was kept under constant personal surveillance by postal inspectors from about 5 p.m. November 22nd until midnight November 24th. A modified surveillance has maintained thereafter. No one called for mail out of this box. Indeed, the only mail in the box was a Russian magazine addressed to Oswald. The single outstanding key was recovered from Oswald immediately after he was taken into custody. In appraising the import of Oswald's rental of post office boxes, it is significant that he was not secretive about their use. All 3 boxes were rented by Oswald using his true name. His application for box number 2915 showed his home address as that of Alexandra de Mohrenschildt, whose husband had agreed to allow Oswald to use his address. His application for the New Orleans box listed his address as 657 French Street. His aunt, Lillian Muret, lived at 757 French Street. On the application for box number 6225, Oswald gave an incorrect street number, though he did show Beckley Avenue, where he was then living. He furnished the box numbers to his brother, to an employer, to Texas and New Orleans unemployment commissions, and to others. Based on all the facts disclosed by its investigation, the commission has attached no conspiratorial significance to Oswald's rental of post office boxes. Oswald's use of aliases is also well established. In Chapter 4, the evidence relating to his repeated use of the name A.J. Heidel and close variants thereof is set forth. Because Oswald's use of this pseudonym became known quickly after the assassination, investigations were conducted with regard to persons using the name Heidel or names similar to it. Subversive files, public carrier records, telegraph company records, banking and other commercial records, and other matters investigated and persons interviewed have been examined with regard to Oswald's true name and his known aliases. No evidence has been produced that Oswald ever used the name Heidel as a means of making undercover contact with any person. Indeed, though Oswald did prepare a counterfeit selective service card and other identification using his name, he commonly used Heidel to represent persons other than himself, such as the president of his non-existent Fair Play for Cuba Committee chapter, the doctor whose name appeared on his counterfeit international certificate of vaccination, and as references on his job applications. Elwyn Cole, question document expert for the Treasury Department, testified that the false identification found on Oswald upon his arrest could have been produced by employing elementary techniques used in a photographic printing plant. See Appendix 10, pages 571 to 578. Though to perform the necessary procedures would have been difficult without the use of expensive photographic equipment, such equipment and the needed film and photographic paper were available to Oswald when he was employed from October 1962 through early April 1963 at Jaggers Childs Stovall, a commercial advertising photography firm in Dallas. While so employed, Oswald is known to have become familiar with the mechanics of photographic enlargements, contraction, and image distortion that would have been necessary to produce his false identification, and to have used the facilities of his employer for some personal work. Cole testified that the cards in Oswald's wallet did not exhibit a great deal of skill, pointing out various errors that had been committed. Oswald's supervisor at Jaggers Chiles Stovall has stated that Oswald seemed unable to perform photographic work with precision, which was one of the main reasons for which he was ultimately discharged. The retouched negatives used to make Oswald's counterfeit certificate of service identification were found among Oswald's personal effects after his arrest, as was a rubber stamping kit apparently employed to produce his spurious international certificate of vaccination. There is strong evidence thereof that Oswald himself made the various pieces of counterfeit identification which he carried, and there is no reason to believe that he received assistance from any person in establishing his alias. Oswald also used incorrect names other than Heidel, but these two appear unconnected with any form of conspiracy. Oswald's last name appears as Lee in 3 places in connection with his trip to Mexico City discussed above. His tourist card was typed by the Mexican consulate in New Orleans, Lee, Harvey Oswald. However, the comma seems to have been a clerical error, since Oswald signed both the application and the card itself, Lee H. Oswald. Moreover, Oswald seems originally to have also printed his name evenly spaced as Lee H. Oswald, but noting that the form instructed him to print full name, no initials, printed the remainder of his middle name after the H. The clerk who typed the card thus saw a space after Lee, followed by Harvey Oswald, crowded together, and probably assumed that Lee was the applicant's last name. See Commission Exhibit 2481, page 300. The clerk who prepared Oswald's bus reservation for his return trip wrote H. O. Lee. He stated that he did not remember the occasion, although he was sure from the handwriting and from other facts that he had dealt with Oswald. He surmised that he probably made out the reservation directly from the tourist card, since Oswald spoke no Spanish, and seeing the comma, wrote the name H. O. Lee. Oswald himself signed the register at the hotel in Mexico City as Lee, Harvey Oswald. But since the error is identical to that on the tourist card, and since he revealed the remainder of his name, Harvey Oswald, it is possible that Oswald inserted the comma to conform to the tourist card, or that the earlier mistake suggested a new pseudonym to Oswald, which he decided to continue. In any event, Oswald used his correct name in making reservations for the trip to Mexico City, in introducing himself to passengers on the bus, and in his dealings with the Cuban and Soviet embassies. When registering at the Beckley Avenue house in mid-October, Oswald perpetuated the pseudonym by giving his name as O. H. Lee, though he had given his correct name to the owner of the previous rooming house, where he had rented a room after his return from Mexico City. Investigations of the Commission have been conducted with regard to persons using the name Lee, and no evidence has been found that Oswald used this alias for the purpose of making any type of secret contacts. Oswald is also known to have used the surname Osborne in ordering Fair Play for Cuba Committee handbills in May 1963. He also used the false name D.F. Driddle as a certifying witness on the mail order coupon with which he purchased his Smith & Wesson revolver. He used the name Lieutenant J. Evans as a reference on an employment application in New Orleans. Oswald's repeated use of false names is probably not to be disassociated from his antisocial and criminal inclinations. No doubt he purchased his weapons under the name of Heidel in an attempt to prevent their ownership from being traced. Oswald's creation of false names and fictitious personalities is treated in the discussion of possible motives set forth in Chapter 7. Whatever its significance in that respect may be, the Commission has found no indication that Oswald's use of aliases was linked with any conspiracy with others. Ownership of a second rifle. The Commission has investigated a report that during the first 2 weeks of November 1963, Oswald had a telescopic sight mounted and sighted on a rifle at a sporting goods store in Irving, Texas. The main evidence that Oswald had such work performed for him is an undated repair tag bearing the name Oswald from the Irving Sports Shop in Irving, Texas. On November 25, 1963, Dial D. Ryder, an employee of the Irving Sports Shop, presented this tag to agents of the FBI, claiming that the tag was in his handwriting. The undated tag indicated that 3 holes had been drilled in an unspecified type of rifle, and a telescopic sight had been mounted on the rifle and bore sighted. As discussed in Chapter 4, the telescopic sight on the C2766 Mannlicher Carcano rifle was already mounted when shipped to Oswald, and both Ryder and his employer, Charles W. Greener, feel certain that they never did any work on this rifle. If the repair tag actually represented a transaction involving Lee Harvey Oswald, therefore, it would mean that Oswald owned another rifle. Although this would not alter the evidence which establishes Oswald's ownership of the rifle used to assassinate President Kennedy, the possession of a second rifle warranted investigation because it would indicate that a possibly important part of Oswald's life had not been uncovered. Since all of Oswald's known transactions in connection with firearms after his return to the United States were undertaken under an assumed name, it seems unlikely that if he did have repairs made at the sports shop, he would have used his real name. Investigation has revealed that the authenticity of the repair tag bearing Oswald's name is indeed subject to grave doubts. Ryder testified that he found the repair tag while cleaning his workbench on November 23, 1963. However, Ryder spoke with Greener repeatedly during the period between November 22nd through 28th, and sometime prior to November 25th, he discussed with him the possibility that Oswald had been in the store. Neither he nor Greener could remember that he had been. But despite these conversations with Greener, it is significant that Ryder never called the repair tag to his employer's attention. Greener did not learn about the tag until November 28th, when he was called by TV reporters after the story had appeared in the Dallas Times-Herald. The peculiarity of Ryder's silence is compounded by the fact that when speaking to the FBI on November 25th, Ryder fixed the period during which the tag had been issued as November 1st through the 14th, 1963. Yet, from his later testimony, it appears that he did so on the basis that it must have occurred when Greener was on vacation, since Greener did not remember the transaction. Moreover, the FBI had been directed to the Irving Sports Shop by anonymous telephone calls received by its Dallas office and by a local television station. The anonymous male who telephoned the bureau attributed his information to an unidentified sack boy at a specified supermarket in Irving, but investigation has failed to verify this source. Neither Ryder nor Greener claimed that Lee Harvey Oswald had ever been a customer in the Irving Sports Shop. Neither has any recollection of either Oswald or his Mannlicher Carcano rifle, nor does either recall the transaction allegedly represented by the repair tag or the person for whom the repair was supposedly made. Although Ryder stated to the FBI that he was quite sure that he had seen Oswald and that Oswald may have been in the store at one time, when shown a photograph of Oswald during his deposition, Ryder testified he knew the picture to be of Oswald as the pictures in the paper, but as far as seeing the guy personally, I don't think I ever have. Subsequent events also reflect on Ryder's credibility. In his deposition, Ryder emphatically denied that he had talked to any reporters about this matter prior to the time a story about it appeared in the November 28, 1963 edition of the Dallas Times-Herald. Earlier, however, he told an agent of the U.S. Secret Service that the newspaper had misquoted him. Moreover, a reporter for the Dallas Times-Herald has testified that on November 28, 1963, he called Ryder at his home and obtained from him all of the details of the alleged transaction, and his story is supported by the testimony of a second reporter who overheard one end of the telephone conversation. No other person by the name of Oswald in the Dallas-Fort Worth area has been found who had a rifle repaired at the Irving Sports Shop. Possible corroboration for Ryder's story is provided by two women, Mrs. Edith Whitworth, who operates the Furniture Mart, a furniture store located about 1.5 blocks from the Irving Sports Shop, and Mrs. Gertrude Hunter, a friend of Mrs. Whitworth. They testified that in early November of 1963, a man who they later came to believe was Oswald drove up to the Furniture Mart in a two-tone blue and white 1957 Ford automobile, entered the store, and asked about a part for a gun, presumably because of a sign that appeared in the building advertising a gunsmith shop that had formerly occupied part of the premises. When he found that he could not obtain the part, the man allegedly returned to his car and then came back into the store with a woman and two young children to look at furniture, remaining in the store for about 30 to 40 minutes. Upon confronting Marina Oswald, both women identified her as the woman whom they had seen in the store on the occasion in question, although Mrs. Hunter could not identify a picture of Lee Harvey Oswald, and Mrs. Whitworth identified some pictures of Oswald but not others. Mrs. Hunter purported to identify Marina Oswald by her eyes and did not observe the fact that Marina Oswald had a front tooth missing at the time she supposedly saw her. After a thorough inspection of the Furniture Mart, Marina Oswald testified that she had never been on the premises before. The circumstances surrounding the testimony of the two women are helpful in evaluating the weight to be given to their testimony and the extent to which they lend support to Ryder's evidence. The women previously told newspaper reporters that the part for which the man was looking was a plunger, which the Commission has been advised is a colloquial term used to describe a firing pin. This work was completely different from the work covered by Ryder's repair tag, and the firing pin of the assassination weapon does not appear to have been recently replaced. At the time of their depositions, neither woman was able to recall the type of work which the man wanted done. Mrs. Whitworth related to the FBI that the man told her that the younger child with him was born on October 20th, 1963, which was in fact Rachel Oswald's birthday. In her testimony before the Commission, however, Mrs. Whitworth could not state that the man had told her the child's birth date was October 20th, 1963, and in fact expressed uncertainty about the birthday of her own grandchild, which she had previously used as a guide to remembering the birth date of the younger child in the shop. Mrs. Hunter thought that the man she and Mrs. Whitworth believed was Oswald drove the car to and from the store. However, Lee Harvey Oswald apparently was not able to drive an automobile by himself and does not appear to have had access to a car. The two women claimed that Oswald was in the Furniture Mart on a weekday and in mid-afternoon. However, Oswald had reported to work at the Texas School Book Depository on the dates referred to by the women, and there is no evidence that he left his job during business hours. In addition, Ruth Payne has stated that she always accompanied Marina Oswald whenever Marina left the house with her children, and that they never went to the Furniture Mart either with or without Lee Harvey Oswald at any time during October or November of 1963. There is nothing to indicate that in November the Oswalds were interested in buying furniture. Finally, investigation has produced reason to question the credibility of Mrs. Hunter as a witness. Mrs. Hunter stated that one of the reasons she remembers the description of the car in which Oswald supposedly drove to the furniture store was that she was awaiting the arrival of a friend from Houston who drove a similar automobile. However, the friend in Houston has advised that in November 1963 she never visited or planned to visit Dallas, and that she told no one that she intended to make such a trip. Moreover, the friend added, according to the FBI interview report, that Mrs. Hunter has a strange obsession for attempting to inject herself into any big event which comes to her attention, and that she is likely to claim some personal knowledge of any major crime which receives much publicity. She concluded that the entire family is aware of these tall tales Mrs. Hunter tells, and they normally pay no attention to her. Another allegation relating to the possible ownership of a second rifle by Oswald comes from Robert Adrian Taylor, a mechanic at a service station in Irving. Some 3 weeks after the assassination, Taylor reported to the FBI that he thought that, in March or April of 1963, a man he believed to be Oswald had been a passenger in an automobile that stopped at his station for repairs. Since neither the driver nor the passenger had sufficient funds for the repair work, the person believed to be Oswald sold a U.S. Army rifle to Mr. Taylor, using the proceeds to pay for the repairs. However, a second employee at the service station who recalled the incident believed that, despite a slight resemblance, the passenger was not Oswald. Upon reflection, Taylor himself stated that he is very doubtful that the man was Oswald. Rifle practice. Several witnesses believe that in the weeks preceding the assassination they observed a man resembling Oswald practicing with a rifle in the fields and wooded areas surrounding Dallas and at rifle ranges in that area. Some witnesses claimed that Oswald was alone, while others said he was accompanied by one or more other persons. In most instances, investigation has disclosed that there is no substantial basis for believing that the person reported by the various witnesses was Oswald. One group of witnesses, however, believed that they observed Lee Harvey Oswald at the Sports Dome rifle range in Dallas at various times from September through November of 1963. In light of the number of witnesses, the similarity of the descriptions of the man they saw, and the type of weapon they thought the individual was shooting, there is reason to believe that these witnesses did see the same person at the firing range, although the testimony of none of these witnesses is fully consistent with the reported observations of other witnesses. The witnesses who claimed to have seen Oswald at the firing range had more than a passing notice of the person they observed. Malcolm H. Price, Jr. adjusted the scope on the individual's rifle on one occasion. Garland G. Slack had an altercation with the individual on another occasion because he was shooting at Slack's target. And Sterling C. Wood, who, on a third date, was present at the range with his father, Dr. Homer Wood, spoke with his father and very briefly with the man himself about the individual's rifle. All three of these persons, as well as Dr. Wood, expressed confidence that the man they saw was Oswald. Two other persons believed they saw a person resembling Oswald firing a similar rifle at another range near Irving 2 days before the assassination. Although the testimony of these witnesses was partially corroborated by other witnesses, there was other evidence which prevented the commission from reaching the conclusion that Lee Harvey Oswald was the person these witnesses saw. Others who were at the firing range remembered the same individual, but, though noting a similarity to Oswald, did not believe that the man was Oswald. Others either were unable to state whether the man was Oswald or did not recall seeing anybody who they feel may have been Oswald. Moreover, when interviewed on December 2, 1963, Slack recalled that the individual whom he saw had blonde hair, and on December 3, 1963, Price stated that on several occasions when he saw the individual, he was wearing a Bulldogger Texas-style hat and had bubblegum or chewing tobacco in his cheeks. None of these characteristics match those known about Lee Harvey Oswald. Moreover, the date on which Price adjusted the scope for the unknown person was September 28, 1963, but Oswald is known to have been in Mexico City at that time. Since a comparison of the events testified to by Price and Slack strongly suggests that they were describing the same man, there is reason to believe that Slack was also describing a man other than Oswald. In addition, Slack believed he saw the same person at the rifle range on November 10th, and there is persuasive evidence that on November 10th, Oswald was at the Paynes home in Irving and did not leave to go to the rifle range. Finally, the man whom Price assisted on September 28th drove an old car, possibly a 1940 or 1941 Ford. However, there is evidence that Oswald could not drive at that time, and there is no indication that Oswald ever had access to such a car. Neither Oswald's name nor any of his known aliases was found in the sign-in register maintained at the Sports Dome rifle range, though many customers did not sign this register. The allegations pertaining to the companions who reportedly accompanied the man believed to be Oswald are also inconsistent among themselves and conform to no other credible information ascertained by the Commission. Several witnesses noticed a bearded man at the club when the person believed to be Oswald was there, although only one witness thought the two men were together. The bearded gentleman was located, and he was not found to have any connection with Oswald. It seems likely that the identification of Price, Slack, and the Woods was reinforced in their own minds by the belief that the man whom they saw was firing a rifle perhaps identical to Oswald's Mannlicher Carcano. The witnesses agreed that the man they observed was firing a Mauser-type bolt-action rifle with the ammunition clip immediately in front of the trigger action, and that a scope was mounted on the rifle. These features are consistent with the rifle Oswald used for the assassination. The witnesses agreed that the man had accurate aim with the rifle. However, the evidence demonstrated that the weapon fired by the man they observed was different from the assassination rifle. The witnesses agreed that the barrel of the gun which the individual was firing had been shortened in the process of sporterizing the weapon. In addition, Price and Slack recalled that certain pieces were missing from the top of the weapon, and Dr. Wood and his son and others remembered that the weapon spouted flames when fired. None of these characteristics correspond with Oswald's Mannlicher Carcano. Price and Slack believed that the gun did not have a sling, but the assassination weapon did have one. Sterling Wood, on the other hand, recalled that the rifle which he saw had a sling. Price also recalled that he examined the rifle briefly for some indication as to where it had been manufactured, but saw nothing, whereas the words "Made Italy" are marked on the top of Oswald's Mannlicher Carcano. The scope on the rifle observed at the firing range does not appear to be the same as the one on the assassination weapon. Price remembered that the individual told him that his scope was Japanese, that he had paid $18 for it, and that he had it mounted in a gun shop in Cedar Hills, though apparently no such shop exists in that area. The scope on the Mannlicher Carcano was of Japanese origin, but it was worth a little more than $7 and was already mounted when he received the rifle from a mail-order firm in Chicago. Sterling Wood and Slack agreed that the scope had a somewhat different appearance from the scope on the assassination rifle. Though the person believed to be Oswald retained his shell casings, presumably for reuse, all casings recovered from areas where it is believed that Oswald may have practiced have been examined by the FBI laboratory, and none has been found which was fired from Oswald's rifle. Finally, evidence discussed in Chapter 4 tends to prove that Oswald brought his rifle to Dallas from the home of the Paynes in Irving on November 22nd, and there is no other evidence which indicates that he took the rifle or a package which might have contained the rifle out of the Paynes' garage where it was stored prior to that date. Automobile demonstration. The testimony of Albert Guy Bogard has been carefully evaluated because it suggests the possibility that Oswald might have been a proficient automobile driver and, during November 1963, might have been expecting funds with which to purchase a car. Bogard, formerly an automobile salesman with a Lincoln Mercury firm in Dallas, testified that in the early afternoon of November 9, 1963, he attended a prospective customer who he believes was Lee Harvey Oswald. According to Bogard, the customer, after test driving an automobile over the Stemmons Freeway at 60 to 70 miles per hour, told Bogard that in several weeks he would have the money to make a purchase. Bogard asserted that the customer gave his name as Lee Oswald, which Bogard wrote on a business card. After Oswald's name was mentioned on the radio on November 22nd, Bogard assertedly threw the card in a trash can, making the comment to co-employees that he supposed Oswald would no longer wish to buy a car. Bogard's testimony has received corroboration. The assistant sales manager at the time, Frank Pizzo, and a second salesman, Eugene M. Wilson, stated that they recall an instance when the customer described by Bogard was in the showroom. Another salesman, Orrin Brown, recalled that Bogard asked him to assist the customer if he appeared during certain evenings when Bogard was away from the showroom. Brown stated that he too wrote down the customer's name, and both he and his wife remember the name Oswald as being on a paper in his possession before the assassination. However, doubts exist about the accuracy of Bogard's testimony. He, Pizzo, and Wilson differed on important details of what is supposed to have occurred when the customer was in the showroom. Whereas Bogard stated that the customer said he did not wish credit and wanted to purchase a car for cash, Pizzo and Wilson both indicated that the man did attempt to purchase on credit. According to Wilson, when the customer was told that he would be unable to purchase a car without a credit rating, substantial cash, or a lengthy employment record, he stated sarcastically, "Maybe I'm going to have to go back to Russia to buy a car." While it is possible that Oswald would have made such a remark, the statement is not consistent with Bogard's story. Indeed, Bogard has made no mention that the customer ever spoke with Wilson while he was in the showroom. More important, on November 23rd, a search through the showroom's refuse was made, but no paper bearing Oswald's name was found. The paper on which Brown reportedly wrote Oswald's name also has never been located. The assistant sales manager, Mr. Pizzo, who saw Bogard's prospect on November 9th and shortly after the assassination felt that Oswald may have been this man, later examined pictures of Oswald and expressed serious doubt that the person with Bogard was in fact Oswald. While noting a resemblance, he did not believe that Oswald's hairline matched that of the person who had been in the showroom on November 9th. Wilson has stated that Bogard's customer was only about 5 feet tall. Several persons who knew Oswald have testified that he was unable to drive, although Mrs. Payne, who was giving Oswald driving lessons, stated that Oswald was showing some improvement by November. Moreover, Oswald's whereabouts on November 9th, as testified to by Marina Oswald and Ruth Payne, would have made it impossible for him to have visited the automobile showroom, as Mr. Bogard claims. Alleged association with various Mexican or Cuban individuals. The Commission has examined Oswald's known or alleged contacts and activities in an effort to ascertain whether or not he was involved in any conspiracy may be seen in the investigation it conducted as a result of the testimony given by Mrs. Sylvia Odio. The Commission investigated her statements in connection with its consideration of the testimony of several witnesses suggesting that Oswald may have been seen in the company of unidentified persons of Cuban or Mexican background. Mrs. Odio was born in Havana in 1937 and remained in Cuba until 1960. It appears that both of her parents are political prisoners of the Castro regime. Mrs. Odio is a member of the Cuban Revolutionary Junta, JURE, an anti-Castro organization. She testified that late in September 1963, 3 men came to her apartment in Dallas and asked her to help them prepare a letter soliciting funds for JURE activities. She claimed that the men, who exhibited personal familiarity with her imprisoned father, asked her if she were working in the underground, and she replied that she was not. She testified that 2 of the men appeared to be Cubans, although they also had some characteristics that she associated with Mexicans. Those 2 men did not state their full names but identified themselves only by their fictitious underground war names. Mrs. Odio remembered the name of one of the Cubans as Leopoldo. The 3rd man, an American, allegedly was introduced to Mrs. Odio as Leon Oswald, and she was told that he was very much interested in the Cuban cause. Mrs. Odio said that the men told her that they had just come from New Orleans and that they were then about to leave on a trip. Mrs. Odio testified that the next day Leopoldo called her on the telephone and told her that it was his idea to introduce the American into the underground because he is great. He is kind of nuts. Leopoldo also said that the American had been in the Marine Corps and was an excellent shot, and that the American said the Cubans don't have any guts because President Kennedy should have been assassinated after the Bay of Pigs, and some Cubans should have done that because he was the one that was holding the freedom of Cuba, actually. Although Mrs. Odio suggested doubts that the men were in fact members of JURE, she was certain that the American who was introduced to her as Leon Oswald was Lee Harvey Oswald. Her sister, who was in the apartment at the time of the visit by the three men, and who stated that she saw them briefly in the hallway when answering the door, also believed that the American was Lee Harvey Oswald. By referring to the date on which she moved from her former apartment, October 1st, 1963, Mrs. Odio fixed the date of the alleged visit on the Thursday or Friday immediately preceding that date, i.e., September 26th or 27th. She was positive that the visit occurred prior to October 1st. During the course of its investigation, however, the Commission concluded that Oswald could not have been in Dallas on the evening of either September 26th or 27th, 1963. It also developed considerable evidence that he was not in Dallas at any time between the beginning of September and October 3rd, 1963. On April 24th, Oswald left Dallas for New Orleans, where he lived until his trip to Mexico City in late September and his subsequent return to Dallas. Oswald is known to have been in New Orleans as late as September 23, 1963, the date on which Mrs. Payne and Marina Oswald left New Orleans for Dallas. Sometime between 4 p.m. on September 24th and 1 p.m. on September 25th, Oswald cashed an unemployment compensation check at a store in New Orleans. Under normal procedures, this check would not have reached Oswald's postal box in New Orleans until at least 5 a.m. on September 25th. The store at which he cashed the check did not open until 8 a.m. Therefore, it appeared that Oswald's presence in New Orleans until sometime between 8 a.m. and 1 p.m. on September 25th was quite firmly established. Although there is no firm evidence of the means by which Oswald traveled from New Orleans to Houston on the first leg of his Mexico City trip, the Commission noted that a Continental Trailways bus leaving New Orleans at 12:30 p.m. on September 25th would have brought Oswald to Houston at 10:50 p.m. that evening. His presence on this bus would be consistent with other evidence before the Commission. There is strong evidence that on September 26th, 1963, Oswald traveled on Continental Trailways bus number 5133, which left Houston at 2:35 a.m. for Laredo, Texas. Bus company records disclose that one ticket from Houston to Laredo was sold during the night shift on September 25th, 26th, and that such ticket was the only one of its kind sold in the period of September 24th through September 26th. The agent who sold this ticket has stated that Oswald could have been the purchaser. Two English passengers, Dr. and Mrs. John B. McFarland, testified that they saw Oswald riding alone on this bus shortly after they awoke at 6 a.m. The bus was scheduled to arrive in Laredo at 1:20 p.m. on September 26th, and Mexican immigration records show that Oswald in fact crossed the border at Laredo to Nuevo Laredo, Mexico between 6 a.m. and 2 p.m. on that day. Evidence set out in Appendix 13 establishes that Oswald did not leave Mexico until October 3rd and that he arrived in Dallas the same day. The Commission noted that the only time not strictly accounted for during the period that Mrs. Odio thought Oswald might have visited her is the span between the morning of September 25th and 2:35 a.m. on September 26th. The only public means of transportation by which Oswald could have traveled from New Orleans to Dallas in time to catch his bus from Houston to Laredo would have been the airlines. Investigation disclosed no indication that he flew between these points. Moreover, it did not seem probable that Oswald would speed from New Orleans, spend a short time talking to Sylvia Odio, and then travel from Dallas to Mexico City and back on the bus. Automobile travel, in the time available, though perhaps possible, would have been difficult. The commission noted, however, that if Oswald had reached Dallas on the evening of September 25th, he could have traveled by bus to Alice, Texas, and there caught the bus which had left Houston for Laredo at 2:35 a.m. on September 26, 1963. Further investigation in that regard indicated, however, that no tickets were sold during the period September 23rd through the 26th, 1963, for travel from Dallas to Laredo or points beyond by the Dallas office of Continental Trailways, the only bus line on which Oswald could have made connections with the bus on which he was later seen. Furthermore, if Oswald had traveled from Dallas to Alice, he would have not reached the Houston to Laredo bus until after he was first reportedly observed on it by the McFarlands. Oswald had also told passengers on the bus to Laredo that he had traveled from New Orleans by bus and made no mention of an intervening trip to Dallas. In addition, the commission noted evidence that on the evening of September 25, 1963, Oswald made a telephone call to a party in Houston proposing to visit a resident of Houston that evening, and the fact that such a call would appear to be inconsistent with Oswald's having been in Dallas at that time. It thus appeared that the evidence was persuasive that Oswald was not in Dallas on September 25th, and therefore that he was not in that city at the time Mrs. Odio said she saw him. In spite of the fact that it appeared almost certain that Oswald could not have been in Dallas at the time Mrs. Odio thought he was, the commission requested the FBI to conduct further investigation to determine the validity of Mrs. Odio's testimony. The commission considered the problems raised by that testimony as important in view of the possibility it raised that Oswald may have had companions on his trip to Mexico. The commission specifically requested the FBI to attempt to locate and identify the two men who Mrs. Odio stated were with the man she thought was Oswald. In an effort to do that, the FBI located and interviewed Manuel Rey, a leader of JURE, who confirmed that Mrs. Odio's parents were political prisoners in Cuba, but stated that he did not know anything about the alleged Oswald visit. The same was true of Rogelio Cisneros, a former anti-Castro leader from Miami who had visited Mrs. Odio in June of 1962 in connection with certain anti-Castro activities. Additional investigation was conducted in Dallas and in other cities in search of the visitors to Mrs. Odio's apartment. Mrs. Odio herself was re-interviewed. On September 16, 1964, the FBI located Loran Eugene Hall in Johnsondale, California. Hall had been identified as a participant in numerous anti-Castro activities. He told the FBI that in September of 1963, he was in Dallas soliciting aid in connection with anti-Castro activities. He said he had visited Mrs. Odio. He was accompanied by Lawrence Howard, a Mexican-American from East Los Angeles, and one William Seymour from Arizona. He stated that Seymour is similar in appearance to Lee Harvey Oswald. He speaks only a few words of Spanish, as Mrs. Odio had testified one of the men who visited her did. While the FBI had not yet completed its investigation into this matter at the time the report went to press, the commission has concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald was not at Mrs. Odio's apartment in September of 1963. The commission has also noted the testimony of Evaristo Rodriguez, a bartender in the Havana bar in New Orleans, to the effect that he saw Oswald in that bar in August of 1963 in the company of a Latin-appearing man. Rodriguez's description of the man accompanying the person he thought to be Oswald was similar in respects to the description given by Sylvia Odio, since both testified that the man may have been of either Cuban or Mexican extraction and had a slight bald spot on the forepart of his hairline. Rodriguez's identification of Oswald was uncorroborated except for the testimony of the owner of the bar, Oreste Peña. According to Rodriguez, Peña was not in a position to observe the man he thought later to have been Oswald. Although Pena has testified that he did observe the same person as did Rodriguez and that this person was Oswald, an FBI interview report indicated that a month earlier Pena had stated that he could not at this time or at any time say whether or not the person was identical with Lee Harvey Oswald. Though, when testifying, Pena identified photographs of Oswald, the FBI report also recorded that Pena stated the only reason he was able to recognize Oswald was because he had seen Oswald's picture in the news media so often after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. When present at Pena's bar, Oswald was supposed to have been intoxicated to the extent that he became ill, which is inconsistent with other evidence that Oswald did not drink alcoholic beverages to excess. The Commission has also noted the testimony of Dean Andrews, an attorney in New Orleans. Andrews stated that Oswald came to his office several times in the summer of 1963 to seek advice on a less than honorable discharge from the armed forces, the citizenship status of his wife, and his own citizenship status. Andrews, who believed that he was contacted on November 23rd to represent Oswald, testified that Oswald was always accompanied by a Mexican and was at times accompanied by apparent homosexuals. Andrews was able to locate no records of any of Oswald's alleged visits, and the investigation has failed to locate the person who supposedly called Andrews on November 23rd, at a time when Andrews was under heavy sedation. While one of Andrews' employees felt that Oswald might have been at his office, his secretary has no recollection of Oswald being there. Oswald was not an agent for the U.S. government. From the time of his release from the Marine Corps until the assassination, Lee Harvey Oswald dealt in various transactions with several agencies of the U.S. government. Before departing the United States for the Soviet Union in 1959, he obtained an American passport, which he returned to the embassy in Moscow in October 1959 when he attempted to renounce his U.S. citizenship. Thereafter, while in the Soviet Union, Oswald had numerous contacts with the American embassy, both in person and through correspondence. 2 years later, he applied for the return and renewal of his passport, which was granted him. His application concerning the admittance of his wife to this country was passed upon the Immigration and Naturalization Service of the Department of Justice in addition to the State Department. And before returning to this country, he secured a loan from the State Department to help cover his transportation costs from Moscow to New York. These dealings with the Department of State and the Immigration and Naturalization Service have been reviewed earlier in this chapter and are considered in detail in Appendix 15. After his return, Oswald was interviewed on 3 occasions by agents of the FBI, and Mrs. Payne was also questioned by the FBI about Oswald's activities. Oswald obtained a second passport in June of 1963, and both the FBI and the CIA took note of his Fair Play for Cuba Committee activities in New Orleans and his appearance at the Soviet consulate in Mexico City. For reasons which will be discussed fully in Chapter 8, Oswald's name was never given to the U.S. Secret Service. These dealings have given rise to numerous rumors and allegations that Oswald may have been a paid informant or some type of undercover agent for a federal agency, usually the FBI or the CIA. The Commission has fully explored whether Oswald had any official or unofficial relationship with any federal agencies beyond that already described. Oswald's mother, Mrs. Marguerite Oswald, testified before the Commission that she believes her son went to Russia and returned as an undercover agent for the U.S. government. Mrs. Oswald mentioned the belief that her son was an agent to a State Department representative whom she visited in January 1961 when she was trying to locate her son. She had been interviewed earlier by FBI agent John W. Fain within some 6 months of Oswald's departure for Russia, and did not at that time suggest such an explanation for Oswald's departure. Though provided the opportunity to present any material she considered pertinent, Mrs. Oswald was not able to give the Commission any reasonable basis for her speculation. As discussed later in this chapter, the Commission has investigated Marguerite Oswald's claim that an FBI agent showed her a picture of Jack Ruby after the assassination but before Lee Harvey Oswald had been killed. This allegation was inaccurate since the picture was not of Ruby. After the assassination, it was reported that in 1962, Oswald had told Pauline Bates, a public stenographer in Fort Worth, Texas, that he had become a secret agent of the U.S. government and that he was soon going back to Russia for Washington. Mrs. Bates, in her sworn testimony, denied that Oswald ever told her anything to that effect. She testified that she had stated that when he first said that he went to Russia and had gotten a visa, that I thought, it was just a thought, that maybe he was going over under the auspices of the State Department as a student or something. In order to evaluate the nature of Oswald's dealing with the Department of State and the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the Commission has obtained the complete files of both the Department and the Service pertaining to Lee Harvey Oswald. Officials who were directly involved in dealing with the Oswald case on these matters have testified before the Commission. A critical evaluation of the manner in which they were handled by these organizations is set forth in Appendix 15. The record establishes that Oswald received no preferential treatment and that his case involved no impropriety on the part of any government official. Director John A. McCone and Deputy Director Richard Helms of the Central Intelligence Agency testified before the Commission that no one connected with the CIA had ever interviewed Oswald or communicated with him in any way. In his supplementing affidavit, Director McCone stated unequivocally that Oswald was not an agent, employee, or informant of the CIA, that the agency never communicated with him in any manner or furnished him any compensation, and that Oswald was never directly or indirectly associated with the CIA. The Commission has had access to the full CIA file on Oswald, which is entirely consistent with Director McCone's statements. The Director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, assistants to the Director Alan H. Belmont, FBI agents John W. Fain and John L. Quigley, who interviewed Oswald, and FBI agent James P. Hosty, Jr., who was in charge of his case at the time of the assassination, have also testified before the Commission. All declared in substance that Oswald was not an informant or agent of the FBI, that he did not act in any other capacity for the FBI, and that no attempt was made to recruit him in any capacity. Director Hoover and each Bureau agent who, according to the FBI, would have been responsible for or aware of any attempt to recruit Oswald as an informant have also provided the Commission with sworn affidavits to this effect. Director Hoover has sworn that he caused a search to be made of the records of the Bureau and that the search discloses that Oswald was never an informant of the FBI and never assigned a symbol number in that capacity and was never paid any amount of money by the FBI in any regard. This testimony is corroborated by the Commission's independent review of the Bureau files dealing with the Oswald investigation. The Commission also investigated the circumstances which led to the presence in Oswald's address book of the name of Agent Hosty, together with his office address, telephone number, and license number. Hosty and Mrs. Payne testify that on November 1, 1963, Hosty left his name and phone number with Mrs. Payne so that she could advise Hosty when she learned where Oswald was living in Dallas. Mrs. Payne and Marina Oswald have testified that Mrs. Payne handed Oswald the slip of paper on which Hosty had written this information. In accordance with prior instructions from Oswald, Marina Oswald noted Hosty's license number, which she gave to her husband. The address of the Dallas office of the FBI could have been obtained from many public sources. Thus, close scrutiny of the records of the federal agencies involved and the testimony of the responsible officials of the U.S. government established that there was absolutely no type of informant or undercover relationship between an agency of the U.S. government and Lee Harvey Oswald at any time. Oswald's finances. In search of activities or payments demonstrating the receipt of unexplained funds, the Commission undertook a detailed study of Oswald's receipts and expenditures starting with the date of his return from the Soviet Union on June 13, 1962, and continuing to the date of his arrest on November 22, 1963. In Appendix 14, there appears a table listing Oswald's estimated receipts and expenditures on a monthly basis during this period. The Commission was assisted in this phase of the investigation by able investigators of the Internal Revenue Service of the Department of the Treasury and by agents of the FBI. The investigation extended far beyond interrogation of witnesses who appeared before the Commission. At banks in New Orleans, Louisiana, Fort Worth, Dallas, Houston, and Laredo, Texas, inquiries were made for any record of a checking, savings, or loan accounts or a safe deposit box rented in the names of Lee Harvey Oswald, his known aliases, or members of his immediate family. In many cases, a photograph of Oswald was exhibited to bank officials who were in a position to see a person in the safe deposit box area of their banks. No bank account or safe deposit boxes were located which could be identified with Oswald during this period of his life, although evidence was developed of a bank account which he had used prior to his trip to the Soviet Union in 1959. Telegraph companies were checked for the possibility of money orders that may have been sent to Oswald. All known locations where Oswald cashed checks which he received were queried as to the possibility of his having cashed other checks there. Further inquiries were made at Oswald's place of employment, his residences, and with local credit associations, hospitals, utility companies, state and local government offices, post offices, periodicals, newspapers, and employment agencies. Marina Oswald testified that she knew of no sources of income other than his wages and his unemployment compensation. No evidence of other cash income has been discovered. The Commission has found that the funds known to have been available to Oswald during the period of June 13, 1962 through November 22, 1963 were sufficient to cover all of his known expenditures during this period, including cash on hand of $63 when he arrived from the Soviet Union. The Oswalds received a total of $3,665.89 in cash from wages, unemployment compensation benefits, loans, and gifts from acquaintances. His cash disbursements during this period were estimated at $3,501.79, leaving a balance of $164.10. See Appendix 14. This estimated balance is within $19 of the $183.87 in cash which was actually in Oswald's possession at the time of his arrest, consisting of $13.87 on his person and $170 in his wallet left at the Payne house. In computing Oswald expenditures, estimates were made for food, clothing, and incidental expenses. The incidental expenses included telephone calls, the cost of local newspapers, money order and check cashing fees, postage, local transportation costs, personal care goods and services, and other such small items. All of these expenses, including food and clothing, were estimated at a slightly higher figure than would be normal for a family with the income of the Oswalds, and probably higher than the Oswalds actually spent on such items. This was done in order to be certain that even if some of Oswald's minor expenditures are not known, he had adequate funds to cover his known expenditures. During the 17-month period preceding his death, Oswald's pattern of living was consistent with his limited income. He lived with his family in furnished apartments whose cost, including utilities, ranged from about $60 to $75 per month. Witnesses testified to his wife's disappointment and complaints and to their own shock and misgivings about several of the apartments in which the Oswalds lived during the period. Moreover, the Oswalds, particularly Marina, frequently lived with relatives and acquaintances at no cost. Oswald and his family lived with his brother Robert and then with Marguerite Oswald from June until sometime in August 1962. As discussed previously, Marina Oswald lived with Elena Hall and spent a few nights at the Taylor's house during October of 1962. In November of that same year, Marina Oswald lived with two families. When living away from his family, Oswald rented rooms for $7 and $8 per week or stayed at the YMCA in Dallas, where he paid $2.25 per day. During late April and early May 1963, Oswald lived with relatives in New Orleans while his wife lived with Ruth Payne in Irving, Texas. From September 24, 1963 until November 22nd, Marina Oswald stayed with Ruth Payne while Oswald lived in rooming houses in Dallas. During the period Marina Oswald resided with others, neither she nor her husband made any contribution to her support. The Oswalds owned no major household appliances, had no automobile, and resorted to dental and hospital clinics for medical care. Acquaintances purchased baby furniture for them and paid dental bills in one instance. After his return to the United States, Oswald did not smoke or drink, and he discouraged his wife from doing so. Oswald spent much of his time reading books which he obtained from the public library and periodicals to which he subscribed. He resided near his place of employment and used buses to travel to and from work. When he visited his wife and the children on weekends in October and November 1963, he rode in a neighbor's car, making no contribution for gasoline or other expenses. Oswald's personal wardrobe was also very modest. He customarily wore t-shirts, cheap slacks, well-worn sweaters, and well-used zipper jackets. Oswald owned one suit of Russian make and purchase, poor fitting and of heavy fabric, which despite its unsuitability to the climates of Texas and Louisiana and his obvious discomfort, he wore on the few occasions that required dress. Food for his family was extremely meager. Paul Gregory testified that during the 6 weeks that Marina Oswald tutored him, he took the Oswalds shopping for food and groceries on a number of occasions, and that he was amazed at how little they bought. Their friends in the Dallas-Fort Worth area frequently brought them food and groceries. Marina testified that her husband ate very little. He never had breakfast. He just drank coffee, and that is all. Not because he was trying to economize, simply he never liked to eat. She estimated that when he was living by himself in a rooming house, he would spend about $1.30 for dinner and have a sandwich and soft drinks for lunch. The thrift which Oswald exercised in meeting his living expenses allowed him to accumulate sufficient funds to meet other expenses which he incurred after his return from the Soviet Union. From his return until January of 1963, Oswald repaid the $435.71 he had borrowed from the State Department for travel expenses from Moscow and the $200 loan he had obtained from his brother Robert to fly from New York to Dallas upon his return to this country. He completed the retirement of the debt to his brother in October 1962. His cash receipts from all sources from the day of his arrival in Fort Worth through October 1962 aggregated $719.94. It is estimated that he could have made the repayment to Robert and met his other known expenses and still have been left with savings of $122.06 at the end of the month. After making initial $10 payments to the State Department, Oswald paid the government $190 in December and $206 in January, thus liquidating that debt. From this net earning of $805.96 from November through January, plus his prior savings, Oswald could have made these payments to the State Department, met his other known expenses, and still have had a balance of $8.59 at the end of January 1963. In discussing the repayment of these debts, Marina Oswald testified, "Of course, we did not live in luxury. We did not buy anything that was not absolutely needed because Lee had to pay his debt to Robert and to the government, but it was not particularly difficult." Included in the total figure for Oswald's disbursements were $21.45 for the rifle used in the assassination and $31.22 for the revolver with which Oswald shot Officer Tippit. The major portion of the purchase price for these weapons was paid in March 1963 when Oswald had finished paying his debts and the purchases were compatible with the total funds then available to him. During May, June, and July of 1963, Oswald spent approximately $23 for circulars, application blanks, and membership cards for his one-man New Orleans chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. In August, he paid $2 to one and possibly two young men to assist in passing out circulars, and then paid a $10 court fine after pleading guilty to a charge of disturbing the peace. Although some of these expenses were incurred after Oswald lost his job on July 19, 1963, his wages during June and July and his unemployment compensation thereafter provided sufficient funds to enable him to finance these activities out of his own resources. Although Oswald paid his own bus fare to New Orleans on April 24, 1963, his wife and the baby were taken there at no cost to Oswald by Ruth Payne. Similarly, Ruth Payne drove to New Orleans in September and brought Marina Oswald and the baby back to Irving, Texas. Oswald's uncle, Charles Murrett, also paid for the short trip taken by Oswald and his family from New Orleans to Mobile, Alabama, on July 27, 1963. It is estimated that when Oswald left for Mexico City in September 1963, he had accumulated slightly over $200. Marina Oswald testified that when he left for Mexico City, he had a little over $100, though she may have not taken into account the $33 unemployment compensation check which Oswald collected after her departure from New Orleans. In any event, expenses in Mexico have been estimated as approximately $85 based on transportation costs of $50 and a hotel expense of about $1.28 per day. Oswald ate inexpensively, and allowing $15 for entertainment and miscellaneous items, it would appear that he had the funds available to finance the trip. The Commission has considered the testimony of Leonard E. Hutchison, proprietor of Hutch's Market in Irving, in connection with Oswald's finances. Hutchison has testified that on Friday during the first week in November, a man he believes to have been Lee Harvey Oswald attempted to cash a two-party or personal check for $189, but that he refused to cash the check since his policy is to cash personal checks for no more than $25. Oswald is not known to have received a check for this amount from any source. On Friday, November 1st, Oswald did cash a Texas Unemployment Commission check for $33 at another supermarket in Irving, so that a possible explanation of Hutchison's testimony is that he refused to cash this $33 check for Oswald and is simply in error as to the amount of the instrument. However, since the check cashed at the supermarket was issued by the state comptroller of Texas, it is not likely that Hutchison could have confused it with a personal check. Examination of Hutchison's testimony indicates that a more likely explanation is that Oswald was not in his store at all. Hutchison testified that the man who attempted to cash the check was a customer in his store on previous occasions. In particular, Hutchison recalled that the man, accompanied by a woman he believes was Marina Oswald and an elderly woman, were shopping in his store in October or November of 1963 on a night he feels certain was a Wednesday evening. Oswald, however, is not known to have been in Irving on any Wednesday evening during this period. Neither of the two checkers at the market recall such a visit by a person matching the description provided by Hutchison, and both Marina Oswald and Marguerite Oswald deny that they were ever in Hutchison's store. Hutchison further stated that the man made irregular calls at his grocery between 7:20 a.m. and 7:45 a.m. on weekday mornings and always purchased cinnamon rolls and a full gallon of milk. However, the evidence indicates that except for rare occasions, Oswald was in Irving only on weekends. Moreover, Buell Wesley Frazier, who drove Oswald to and from Irving on these occasions, testified that on Monday mornings he picked Oswald up at a point which is many blocks from Hutchison's store and ordinarily by 7:20 a.m. Hutchison also testified that Ruth Payne was an occasional customer in his store. However, Mrs. Payne indicated that she was not in the store as often as Hutchison testified, and her appearance is dissimilar to the description of the woman Hutchison stated was Mrs. Payne. In light of the strong reasons for doubting the correctness of Hutchison's testimony and the absence of any other sign that Oswald ever possessed a check for $189, the commission was unable to conclude that he ever received such a check. The commission has also examined a report that not long before the assassination, Oswald may have received unaccounted funds through money orders sent to him in Dallas. 5 days after the assassination, C.A. Hamblin, early night manager for the Western Union Telegraph Company in Dallas, told his superior that about 2 weeks earlier he remembered Oswald sending a telegram from the office to Washington, D.C., possibly to the Secretary of the Navy, and that the application was completed in an unusual form of hand printing. The next day, Hamblin told a magazine correspondent who was in the Western Union office on other business that he remembered seeing Oswald in the office on prior occasions collecting money orders for small amounts of money. Soon thereafter, Hamblin signed a statement relating to both the telegram and the money orders and specifying 2 instances in which he had seen the person he believed to be Oswald in the office. In each instance, the man had behaved disagreeably and one other Western Union employee had become involved in assisting him. During his testimony, Hamblin did not recall with clarity the statements he had previously made and was unable to state whether the person he reportedly had seen in the Western Union office was or was not Lee Harvey Oswald. Investigation has disclosed that a second employee does recall one of the occurrences described by Hamblin and believes that the money order in question was delivered to someone at the YMCA. However, he is unable to state whether or not the man involved was Oswald. The employee referred to by Hamblin in connection with the second incident feels certain that the unusual episode described by Hamblin did not occur and that she at no time observed Oswald in the Western Union office. At the request of federal investigators, officers of Western Union conducted a complete search of their records in Dallas and other cities for the period from June through November 1963 for money orders payable to Lee Harvey Oswald or his known aliases and for telegrams sent by Oswald or his known aliases. In addition, all money orders addressed to persons at the YMCA in Dallas during October and November 1963 were inspected, and all telegrams handled from November 1st through November 22nd by the employee who Hamblin assertedly saw service Oswald were examined, as were all telegrams sent from Dallas to Washington during November. No indication of any such money order or telegram was found in any of these records. Hamblin himself participated in this search and was unable to pin down any of these telegrams or money orders that would indicate it was Oswald. Hamblin's superiors have concluded that this whole thing was a figment of Mr. Hamblin's imagination, and the commission accepts this assessment.